Chapter 1. The shattered silence. The nebula was alive with venom. Its clouds swirled in hues of sickly green and bruised violet, a storm of ionized toxins that shimmered like a predator's gaze. Every particle carried death, corrosive gases, unstable radiation, and molecular chains that could unravel flesh and alloy alike. To drift here was to court annihilation. Yet against all reason, a lone scout vessel staggered through the poisoned expanse, its hull scarred, its engines coughing sparks into the void. Inside, silence reigned. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, of systems failing one by one. The ship's AI core flickered erratically, its voice reduced to static whispers. Panels hung loose from the walls, wires exposed like veins torn open. The scout's name, ASF-12 Horizon's Wake, was etched faintly across its battered frame, though most of the letters had been scorched away by plasma fire. It was a miracle the vessel still held pressure. The pilot sat slumped in the command chair, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the nebula beyond the cracked viewport. Commander Kalen Vey, human. Survivor. His uniform was shredded, the insignia of the advanced scout fleet barely recognizable beneath burns and blood. His left arm was bound in a crude tourniquet, the fabric soaked dark. Every movement sent pain lancing through his body, but he refused to close his eyes. He knew what waited in the dark if he did. The nebula was not just poison, it was alive. Tendrils of energy coiled through the clouds, patterns too deliberate to be chance. They pulsed in rhythm, as though the storm itself was breathing. Kalen had seen it before, in the final moments of the battle that had destroyed his fleet. Ships swallowed whole, their screams cut short as the nebula consumed them. He alone had escaped, though escape was a cruel word. He was adrift, broken, and hunted. The secret weighed heavier than the wounds. Hidden deep within his ship's encrypted databanks was knowledge no galaxy should ever bear. Coordinates, frequencies, a truth so devastating it could unravel civilizations. Kalen had sworn to protect it, even as his comrades fell, even as the nebula tore reality apart around him. But secrets have gravity, and this one pulled predators closer with every passing hour. A tremor shook the hull. Kalen's hand shot to the console, fingers trembling as he scanned the sensors. The nebula's currents shifted, folding inward like a closing fist. Something was moving within the storm, not random turbulence, intent. He adjusted the ship's trajectory, forcing the failing thrusters to push against the toxic tide. The engine screamed, metal grinding against itself, but the vessel obeyed. Barely. Then came the sound. A low resonance vibrating through the hull, through Kalen's bones. It was not mechanical, it was not natural. It was a voice, vast and alien, carried on frequencies no human throat could form. The nebula spoke, and its words were hunger. Kalen's vision blurred. He forced himself upright, gripping the console until his knuckles whitened. "Not yet," he whispered, though no one was there to hear. His ship was dying, his body failing, but the secret had to endure. If the nebula claimed him, it would claim the knowledge too, and galaxies would burn. The resonance grew louder, shaking loose fragments of the ceiling. Sparks cascaded across the floor. Kalen's sensors lit up with impossible readings. Gravitational distortions, quantum fractures, signatures of ships that should not exist. Shadows moved within the storm, silhouettes of vessels long destroyed, their outlines flickering like ghosts. Were they echoes, projections? Or had the nebula resurrected them, puppets of its will? The scout's lights dimmed. Power reserves dropped to critical. Kalen reached for the emergency beacon, his hand hovering over the activation switch. To send a signal was to invite rescue or annihilation. Whoever answered would learn the secret. Whoever answered might not be human. His breath caught, his pulse hammering in his ears. The choice was a blade pressed against his throat. The nebula's tendrils pressed closer, wrapping around the ship like a predator savoring its prey. Kalen's console flickered, and for a heartbeat a message appeared on the cracked display. Not from his systems, not from any human source. It was written in a language older than stars, symbols that burned themselves into his mind. He could not read them, but he understood their intent. "We know what you carry." His blood ran cold. The nebula was not blind. It was aware. It wanted the secret, and it would not stop until it consumed him, his ship, and the galaxies doomed by the knowledge he bore. Kalen's hand slammed down on the beacon. A pulse of light shot into the storm, cutting through the poison haze. Somewhere someone would see it. Somewhere someone would come. But whether they were saviors or executioners, Kalen could not know. The nebula roared and the scout shuddered as if in defiance. Alone, bleeding and adrift, Commander Kalen Vey whispered into the void, "Let them come." The poisoned storm answered with silence. Would you like me to continue Chapter 2 immediately, or do you want to pause and shape the direction of the story before we dive deeper into the next stage of tension? We need to write Chapter 2 of a 12-chapter story. The given text is the end of Chapter 1. Actually, the user says, write Chapter 2 of 12, and then provides the story so far, which ends with the poisoned storm answered with silence. So that's the end of Chapter 1. Now we need to write Chapter 2. It must be very long, incredibly detailed, suspense-full, building extreme tension. Output only narrative text. No preamble, no conclusions. Just the chapter. We need to continue from Kalen Vey sending the beacon. The Nebula is aware, hungry, speaking. The secret he carries is that he knows something that owns galaxies. The chapter should deepen the tension, perhaps introduce a response to the beacon or further internal-external conflict. The Nebula's tendrils are around the ship, power critical. He is alone, bleeding. The chapter should be detailed, perhaps describing the ship's systems failing, his injuries, the nebula's influence, maybe a hallucination or a confrontation with the entity. The secret must be hinted at but not revealed. Build suspense. I'll write a long chapter, focusing on sensory details, internal monologue, the ship's decay, and the nebula's psychological assault. Possibly a rescue attempt that is not what it seems, or a deeper exploration of the nebula's nature. The user wants extreme tension, so every moment should feel like a countdown. Let me write. Chapter 2. The silence that followed the beacon's pulse was not empty. It was a living thing, a held breath in the throat of the nebula. Kalen's fingers remained pressed against the activation switch, the metal still warm from the burst of energy. The display had gone dark, the message from the nebula erased as if it had never been. But the afterimage of those burning symbols lingered on his retina, seared into the tissue of his mind like a brand. We know what you carry. The words were not human, but they were precise. They were a statement of fact, not a threat. That was what terrified him most. He forced his hand away from the console and let it fall to his side. The motion pulled at the wound in his shoulder, a deep gash from a shard of hull plating during the first ambush. The ship's medkit had administered a basic sealant, but the bleeding had only slowed, not stopped. A dark stain spread across the gray fabric of his flight suit, warm and wet against his ribs. He did not have the luxury of time to tend to it. The nebula had given him a moment of quiet, and he intended to use it. The scout's interior was a ruin. Sparks flickered from exposed conduits along the ceiling, casting strobing shadows across the walls. The main viewport was a spiderweb of cracks, the outer layer of polarized glass shattered by micrometeorites and debris. Through the fractures, the nebula swirled, a churning ocean of violet and crimson, laced with veins of sickly green. The poison was visible, a spectral fog that clung to the hull and seeped through every breach. The ship's atmospheric scrubbers were running at 40% efficiency. He had maybe 6 hours before the air turned toxic. Less, if the filters clogged completely. He moved through the cabin with the practiced economy of a man who had learned to function despite pain. Every step sent a jolt through his shoulder, but he did not stop. He checked the emergency stores, rations for 3 weeks, water for 10 days, a single spare oxygen canister. The beacon had drained the last of the primary power cell. The backup was a hand-cranked generator, a relic from a century ago, designed to keep the transponder alive for another few hours. He had already used it once. The crank sat in its cradle, the metal handle slick with his blood. Kalen lowered himself into the pilot's seat, the cushion stiff with age and neglect. The console was dead, but the ship's black box recorder was still functional, a hardened data core buried in the aft section, shielded against radiation and EMP. He reached beneath the seat and retrieved a handheld datapad, its screen cracked but still lit. He had synced the core to this pad before the power died. The secret was there, encoded in a cipher he had written himself, using a language only he understood. It was a language born of desperation, a mash of dead dialects and mathematical symbols, designed to be indecipherable to anyone who did not hold the key. He had memorized the key, but his mind was a fragile vessel. The nebula's voice had already begun to erode his thoughts. He could feel it, a faint scratching at the edges of his consciousness, like a thing trying to claw its way in. He opened the pad and scrolled through the data. Lines of code scrolled past, punctuated by his own handwritten annotations. The images were burned into his memory, but he needed to see them again to confirm that they were real. The first image was a star map, its coordinates plotted in a region of space long considered empty. The second was a spectrographic analysis of a signal that should not exist, a signal that had been buried for millennia. The third was a photograph of a ship. It was not a human ship. It was not a ship of any known species. It was a thing of impossible geometry, its hull composed of material that absorbed light, its surface etched with the same symbols that had just appeared on his console. The ship had been found drifting at the edge of the nebula, its power signature dormant, its crew absent. The discovery had been classified at the highest level. Kalen had been one of the few authorized to examine the data. He had been chosen because he was a scout, because he was expendable, because if the secret was too dangerous, he could be silenced without question. He had not been silenced. He had fled. The datapad trembled in his hand. The scratching in his mind grew louder, more insistent. He looked up from the screen and saw that the cracks in the viewport had begun to move. They were not spreading from the impact points. They were rearranging themselves, shifting like living things, forming patterns that mirrored the symbols on the ancient ship. The nebula was writing on his window. He threw the datapad onto the seat and stood too fast. The world swam, and he grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder, and he tasted copper on his tongue. The nebula's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a low hum, a vibration that resonated in his bones. It was speaking to him, not in words but in pressures and temperatures, in the subtle shifts of gravity that made his inner ear spin. It was trying to understand him, to map his neural pathways, to find the location of the secret within his skull. He stumbled to the rear of the cabin, where the emergency beacon's transmitter was housed. The unit was a small cylinder, bolted to the bulkhead, its antenna run through a pressure seal to the exterior. The beacon had been fired once. The signal was out there, traveling at the speed of light, cutting through the nebula's interference toward the nearest relay station. If the relay was still operational, the message would reach Fleet Command within 3 days. If the relay had been destroyed, if the nebula had already consumed it, then the signal would dissipate into the void unheard. He had no way to know. The nebula had cut him off from all external sensors. The only data he had was what he could see through the cracks, and that was unreliable. The storm was a kaleidoscope of distortions, bending light and time. He had seen the ghosts of ships, but he could not trust his eyes. The nebula was a liar. It showed him what it wanted him to see. A sound came from the hull, a low, resonant thump like a giant fist striking the metal. The ship shuddered, and a fine dust of rust and insulation rained from the ceiling. Kalen froze, his hand hovering over the manual override for the airlock. The thump came again, this time from the starboard side. Something was outside. Something was touching the ship. He moved to the airlock, his footsteps silent on the grated floor. The inner door was sealed, its indicator light glowing a steady red. He pressed his ear against the cold metal and listened. At first there was nothing but the hum of the nebula, a constant drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then he heard it, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like claws dragging across the outer hull. The thing was moving, circling the ship, probing for a weakness. The scraping stopped. Silence returned. Kalen held his breath, his heart pounding so loud he was sure it could be heard through the hull. Then a voice spoke, not in his mind but through the ship's external speakers. The speakers were dead. He had checked them himself, but the voice came through them anyway, distorted and crackling as if transmitted from a great distance. "Commander Kalen Vey." The voice was human. It was a woman's voice, calm and composed, with the clipped precision of military protocol. It was a voice he recognized. It was the voice of Lieutenant Commander Alara Thorne, his former commanding officer, the woman who had ordered him to destroy the data, the woman who had tried to kill him. "Commander Vey, your beacon has been received. We are en route to your position. Estimated time of arrival, 4 hours. Maintain your current trajectory. Do not deviate. Repeat, do not deviate." The speakers went silent. Kalen stood frozen, his mind racing. The voice was impossible. Thorne was dead. He had seen her die, her ship torn apart by the same ambush that had crippled his own. The nebula had consumed her, just as it had consumed the others. He had watched her ship vanish into the storm, its signals fading into static. Unless she had survived, unless the nebula had spared her, kept her alive to be used as a tool. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. The nebula knew about the secret. It knew about the ancient ship. It knew about the photograph. And now it was using Thorne's voice to lure him into a trap. He stepped back from the airlock, his hand shaking. He looked at the cracked viewport, at the symbols that writhed and twisted on the glass. The nebula was not just a phenomenon. It was a predator. It had a mind. It had a purpose. And it had been waiting for him. The datapad lay on the pilot's seat, its screen still glowing. He picked it up and stared at the photograph of the ancient ship. The ship's hull was covered in the same symbols that now decorated his viewport. The symbols were a language that predated every known civilization in the galaxy, a language that contained a message that, if decoded, would reveal the location of something that the nebula wanted, something that the nebula feared. Kalen closed the datapad and tucked it into his flight suit, pressing it against his chest. The secret was not just the data. The secret was the fact that the nebula was not a natural phenomenon. It was a weapon left behind by a race that had vanished long ago, a weapon that had been dormant for eons. The ancient ship was the key. The ship was the source of the nebula's power, and if it fell into the wrong hands, if it fell into the hands of the people who had sent Thorne to kill him, then the galaxy would burn. The scraping sound returned, this time from directly above the cockpit. The hull groaned, and a line of cracks appeared in the ceiling, running from the forward viewport to the rear bulkhead. The ship was breaking apart. The nebula was squeezing, tightening its grip. He had 4 hours before Thorne arrived, 4 hours to decide whether to trust the voice or to run. But there was nowhere to run. The Scout was crippled, its engines dead, its power cells drained. He was adrift in a poisoned nebula, surrounded by a storm that was alive and hungry. He had one card left to play, one secret that the nebula did not know. He had the key to the cipher. The nebula could read his thoughts, could pry into his memories, but it could not decode the data without the key. The key was not written down. It was not stored in any device. It was locked in his mind, a sequence of numbers and words that he had burned into his memory through sheer force of will. The nebula could kill him, but it could not make him speak. He slumped into the pilot's seat, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The pain in his shoulder was a dull throb now, the numbness of blood loss spreading through his arm. He looked at the viewport, at the symbols that danced and shimmered in the storm. The nebula was waiting for him to break. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. The hum of the nebula filled his ears, a lullaby of poison and death. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the voice of Thorne again, repeating the same message over and over. Do not deviate. Do not deviate. He did not have the strength to answer. The ship drifted on, a speck in the vast, churning sea of the nebula. The storm pressed closer, tendrils of gas and radiation wrapping around the hull like the fingers of a drowning god. In the cockpit, the symbols on the viewport began to glow, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. They were not just writing. They were a map of the nebula's heart, a labyrinth of hidden passages and dead ends, a path to the ancient ship. The nebula was showing him the way. It was daring him to follow. And in his sleep, Kalen Vey dreamed of a ship made of shadow and a voice that spoke in the language of stars. We need to write chapter 3 of 12. The story so far: Kalen Vey is a scout, poisoned Nebula battle-damaged ship, secret that dooms galaxies. He has a key to a cipher in his mind. Nebula is sent Int trying to get the key. Orn is coming to kill him in 4 hours. He has a choice: trust the voice, the Nebula, or run, but no power, he fell asleep. End of chapter 2, dreaming of a ship of shadow and a voice speaking in stars. Now chapter 3, must be very long, incredibly detailed, suspense fall. Build extreme tension. Output only narrative text, need to continue from his dream. He is asleep, but the nebula is active. Perhaps the dream is a communication. He wakes up, or the dream progresses. The ship is breaking apart. He has 4 hours. Need to raise stakes. Maybe Orn arrives early, or the Nebula's pressure increases. He must decide to trust the voice. The voice could be the ancient ship's AI, or the Nebula itself. The Nebula is hungry but also showed him a map. He has the key. The cipher is in his mind. I'll write a detailed chapter focusing on his internal struggle, the physical decay of the ship, the Nebula's increasing assault, and a confrontation with Orn, maybe not yet, but tension of approaching. He might attempt to use the key to access the Nebula's map. Or he discovers something about his own past. Keep suspense. Use sensory details: sounds, smells, radiation burns, hallucinations. The dream: a ship of shadow, a voice. He wakes up to find the ship's systems partially reactivated, or the nebula has infiltrated the hull. He must make a choice: trust the voice, the Nebula's map, or try to repair the ship. But he has no tools, the secret. The cipher key is a sequence that unlocks the ancient weapon. The Nebula wants it to destroy galaxies, or to prevent it. The story says the secret dooms galaxies, so he must protect it. Orn is sent to kill him to prevent the secret from falling into wrong hands. Or Orn is the wrong hands. The voice said, trust me or run. The voice might be the Nebula, which is actually the ancient ship's defense system. Or a trap. I'll have him wake up from the dream with a new understanding. The dream gave him a location, the heart of the nebula. The ship's navigation is dead, but he can use the Nebula's map. He decides to trust the voice, but then realizes the voice is the nebula itself, which is the ancient ship's consciousness. The nebula is a weapon that was dormant, now awakening. He must navigate through the nebula's passages to reach the ship. But Orn is closing in. He uses his key to decode a hidden message from the nebula's symbols. He finds a way to temporarily restore power by interfacing with the nebula's energy. But it's dangerous. The chapter ends with him setting a course into the storm, with Thorn's ship appearing on the horizon. Extreme tension. I'll write in third-person limited deep POV of KLN. Use vivid descriptions of the nebula's colors, sounds, the feeling of being crushed, the ship's grow ends, his physical pain, his memories of his mission, his training, the cipher. The key is a mnemonic device, a poem or a sequence of numbers tied to his past. He must not forget. The Nebula tries to pry it from his mind. He fights back. He uses meditation or pain to focus. He finally decides to trust the voice because he has no other option. But it's a gamble. The chapter ends with him plunging into a tunnel of gas and Orn's missile locking on. Cliffhanger. I'll aim for 203,000 words. Very detailed. Start with him in the dream, then transition to waking. The dream: he is standing on the bridge of the ancient ship made of obsidian and crystal. A figure of light speaks. It shows him the history. The ship was a weapon to cleanse the universe of a cosmic plague. The nebula is the ship's immune system. The cipher key is the activation code. If the wrong people get it, they will use it to destroy life. So he must keep it secret. But the nebula, the ship, wants him to activate it to stop Orn, or to destroy Orn. The voice says, I am the ship, I am the nebula, you are the key. Then he wakes. He wakes to find the cockpit ceiling cracked, gas sea epping in. He puts on his helmet, the ship's systems flicker. He sees a new symbol on the viewport, a path. He decides to follow it. He manually overrides the dead engines using a backup power cell. He enters a series of tunnels. The Nebula's radiation intensifies. His suit alarms. He has minutes. Orange ship appears on radar. He must go faster. He uses the key to decode a sequence that opens a passage. The Nebula parts. He sees the ancient ship, a colossal structure of dark metal floating in a bubble of calm. But Orn fires a torpedo. The chapter ends with the torpedo entering the tunnel behind him. He has seconds to reach the ship before it explodes. I'll write that. The dream was not a dream. It was a transmission, a frequency that bypassed his conscious mind and spoke directly to the primal circuits of his brain. Kalen Vey stood on a bridge that was not made of metal or plasteel, but of something that shimmered like frozen smoke. The walls breathed. The floor pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like the heartbeat of a dying star. Before him, a figure composed of pure white fire stood motionless, its form flickering at the edges, dissolving and reforming with each pulse of the nebula outside. "You carry the key," the figure said. The words did not come from a mouth. They resonated inside his skull, vibrating through his teeth, his bones, the marrow of his spine. "You carry the last fragment of the cipher. Without it, the ship cannot wake. Without it, the storm cannot be tamed." Kalen tried to speak, but his throat was sand. He tried to move, but his feet were rooted to the shimmering floor. The figure stepped closer, and the heat of it washed over him, not burning but reading him, peeling back layers of memory and fear. "I am the ship. I am the nebula. I am the wound that will not heal. And you are the suture." The figure raised a hand of white fire, and the bridge dissolved. Kalen fell through a tunnel of light and shadow, past images that burned into his retinas. A galaxy spinning, a flash of violet annihilation, a fleet of ships turning to ash, a child crying in a burning city. He saw himself, younger, standing over a console, reciting a sequence of numbers and words over and over until they became a scar on his memory. He saw the faces of the people who had trained him, who had branded the cipher into his mind with drugs and sleep deprivation and pain. He saw Thorn standing in a shadowed corridor, a weapon in his hand, his eyes empty. "They will kill you for what you know," the voice said, "or they will use you to kill everything else. There is no third path." Kalen opened his eyes. The cockpit was filled with a pale, greenish light. The symbols on the viewport had changed. They were no longer static but moving, flowing like liquid mercury across the transparent surface, forming patterns that twisted and spiraled inward toward a single point. A map, a path, a promise. The ship groaned. A new crack spiderwebbed across the ceiling, and a fine mist of corrosive gas hissed into the cabin. Kalen's helmet was still on his lap. He fumbled for it, his fingers numb and clumsy, and sealed it over his head. The air cycler whirred to life, filtering out the poison, but the smell of ozone and burnt metal clung to the inside of the visor. He checked the chronometer. 3 hours, 47 minutes until Thorn arrived, but Thorn would not wait. Thorn would push his engines to the limit, would burn through his own reserves, would sacrifice his own ship to reach Kalen before the nebula could claim him. He had less time than the chronometer said. He had no time at all. The voice from the nebula from the ship had offered him a choice, trust or run, but running was impossible. The scout was a corpse, drifting on inertia, its systems bleeding out into the void. The only thing left was trust. Trust in a presence that had already tried to kill him, that had squeezed his ship like a fist, that had shown him a map and dared him to follow. He looked at the symbols on the viewport. They were not random. They were coordinates, encoded in a language older than human civilization, and he had the key to decode them. The cipher was a sequence of numbers and words, burned into his memory through months of conditioning. It was a poem, a string of coordinates, a list of names, a mathematical constant, a fragment of a dead language. It was the only thing the nebula could not take from him. It was the only thing that could unlock the ancient ship. He closed his eyes and recited it silently in his mind. The numbers came first, 47 892 0.001 3.14159 18 2047. Then the words ash, mirror, thorn, silence, blood, key. Then the names, Ve, Thorn, Ethel, Morwen, Ithil. Then the fragment of dead language, Kaler, Ven, Ithil, Mor. He did not know what it meant. He only knew it was the final piece. When he opened his eyes, the symbols on the viewport had rearranged themselves. They formed a single, coherent image, a spiral of light, winding through the nebula, leading to a point of absolute darkness at the center. The heart of the storm, the location of the ancient ship. The nebula was showing him the way. It was keeping its promise. Kalen reached for the controls. The ship's navigation system was dead, its power cells drained to less than 3%. But there was a backup, a manual override that bypassed the main computer and fed directly into the maneuvering thrusters. He had used it once during training in a simulator that had nearly killed him. It required raw manual input, a steady hand, and a willingness to ignore every safety protocol ever written. He activated the override. A small panel slid open on the console, revealing a joystick and a bank of toggle switches. The thrusters had enough fuel for perhaps 30 seconds of burn. 30 seconds to navigate a labyrinth of radiation and gas, to follow a map that was alive and changing, to reach a ship that might not even exist. He grabbed the joystick. His hand was shaking. The blood loss had left him weak, his vision blurring at the edges. He blinked hard, forcing himself to focus. The symbols on the viewport pulsed and the spiral shifted, a new path opening where there had been none. The nebula was guiding him. It was waiting. He toggled the thrusters. The ship lurched forward, a sputtering, uneven motion, like a wounded animal dragging itself across the ground. The hull screamed. The cracks in the ceiling widened, and a shower of sparks rained down from the wiring above. The viewport fogged, then cleared, and he saw the nebula rushing toward him, a wall of green and violet and black. He pushed the joystick forward. The ship plunged into the storm. The first minute was chaos. The nebula was not a passive medium. It was a living thing, and it resisted his passage. Tendrils of gas whipped across the hull, tearing at the already weakened plating. The radiation alarms shrieked, a deafening, piercing wail that he could not silence. The temperature inside the cockpit rose, the air becoming thick and heavy despite the helmet's filters. He was sweating, his hands slick on the joystick, his heart pounding against his ribs. But the map held. The symbols on the viewport shifted and changed, showing him the way through the storm, revealing gaps in the radiation, pockets of calm where the ship could breathe. He followed them blindly, trusting the voice that had spoken to him in his dream, trusting the presence that had tried to crush him only hours before. The ship was falling apart around him. A section of the hull near the aft compartment buckled, and the cabin depressurized with a violent rush of air. His suit tightened, compensating, but the cold seeped through the insulation, biting at his skin. The thrusters sputtered, their fuel nearly gone. He had 10 seconds left, maybe less. The viewport showed a wall of blackness ahead, the heart of the nebula, the ancient ship. He pushed the joystick to the limit and the Scout lurched forward, its engines coughing, its frame groaning. The blackness grew, swallowing the viewport, swallowing the light. For a moment there was nothing but darkness and the sound of his own breathing. Then the ship broke through. The nebula fell away and Kalen was floating in a bubble of empty space. The stars were gone, replaced by a vast, silent void. And in the center of that void, hanging like a tombstone in the darkness, was the ancient ship. It was not a ship. It was a cathedral of shadow and bone. Its hull was black, so black that it seemed to absorb the light around it, a wound in the fabric of space. Its shape was wrong, asymmetrical, with spires and buttresses that jutted out at impossible angles as if it had been grown rather than built. It was massive, kilometers long, a leviathan that dwarfed the Scout into insignificance. And it was awake. Lights flickered along its surface, faint and slow, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. A low hum filled the cockpit, vibrating through the hull, through Kalen's suit, through his teeth. The voice returned, soft and intimate, speaking directly into his mind. "You have come. You have brought the key. Now you must enter. The scout's thrusters died. The fuel was gone. He was drifting, helpless, toward the ancient ship. The black hull loomed closer, and he saw that its surface was not smooth but covered in symbols, the same symbols that had danced on his viewport, the same symbols that had been carved into the walls of the nebula. They were glowing now, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. A hatch opened on the side of the ship, a dark maw that swallowed the light. The scout drifted toward it, pulled by a force he could not see, a gravity that was not gravity. He tried to steer, but there were no controls left. He was a passenger now, a prisoner of the ancient ship. The hatch swallowed him. Darkness closed in, absolute and complete. The hum grew louder, becoming a roar, becoming a voice that spoke in a language he almost understood. You are the key. You are the lock. You are the door. The scout scraped against something, metal screaming against metal. The ship shuddered to a halt. The cockpit lights flickered, then died. The emergency lamps came on, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Kalen sat in the darkness, his breath fogging the inside of his visor. He was inside the ancient ship. He had no power, no weapons, no way out. He had only the cipher locked in his mind and the voice that whispered to him from the shadows. And somewhere behind him in the nebula, Thorn was coming. Thorn was always coming. He unbuckled his harness and stood. His legs buckled, and he caught himself on the edge of the console. The pain in his shoulder was a white-hot spike, but he ignored it. He had to move. He had to find the heart of the ship, the place where the cipher could be used. He had to decide whether to unlock the weapon or to die with its secret. The hatch of the scout hissed open, and the air that rushed in was cold and dry and ancient. It smelled of ozone and dust and something else, something organic like the inside of a tomb. Kalen stepped out into the darkness. The corridor beyond was vast, a tunnel of black metal that stretched into infinity. The walls were covered in the same symbols, glowing now with a faint blue light. They pulsed in rhythm with the hum, a slow, steady beat that matched the rhythm of his heart. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his shadow stretching out before him. The voice spoke again, soft and patient. You have 4 hours, 4 hours to unlock the cipher. 4 hours before the hunter arrives. 4 hours to decide the fate of Galaxies. Kalen kept walking. The symbols on the walls grew brighter and the hum grew louder, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of something moving, something vast and ancient stirring in the darkness. The ancient ship was waking up, and it was hungry. The ancient ship was waking up, and it was hungry. The hum was no longer a sound, it was a physical thing, pressing against Kalen's eardrums, vibrating the fillings in his teeth, seeping through the bones of his skull to wrap around the cipher locked in the folds of his brain. It matched the frantic, thudding rhythm of his heart, each pulse sinking to a slow, deliberate beat that felt less like a machine's idle and more like a living thing's breath. He took a step forward, his boots scuffing the black metal of the corridor, and froze. The metal wasn't cold as he'd expected. It was warm, feverish, almost fleshy under the tread of his mag boots, pulsing gently against the sole of his foot like skin over a beating heart. He knelt, ignoring the white-hot spike of pain that shot down his injured shoulder when he moved, and pulled off his left glove. His fingertips sank a quarter-inch into the surface when he pressed down, meeting a resistance that was neither metal nor plastic, but something hard and calloused and alive, like the belly of a giant, dormant insect. A thin, clear mucus oozed up around his fingers, smelling of ozone, crushed dust, and the same dry, tomb-sweet rot that had filled the scout's airlock when the outer hatch had opened. He yanked his hand back, wiping the slime on his pant leg, his skin crawling. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a body, and it was waking up. The skittering sound from Chapter 5. The pulse of the dead, the skittering sound grew louder, echoing through the corridor like claws dragging across bone. Kalen's breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering in sync with the ship's heartbeat. He pressed his back against the wall, feeling the warmth of its living metal seep into his spine, and forced himself to listen. The sound wasn't random. It was patterned, and a rhythmic stutter like a predator pacing in a cage, waiting for the lock to fail. The voice returned, colder now, stripped of patience. 3 hours remain. The hunter is closer. Kalen swallowed hard, his throat raw from the recycled air of his scout. He thought of the cipher buried in his mind, the weapon encoded in neural strands he barely understood. Every step deeper into this ship felt like a descent into its memory, as if the vessel itself was probing him, peeling back the layers of his consciousness to taste the secret he carried. He had to keep moving. Standing still meant being consumed. The corridor widened into a chamber, vast and cathedral-like. The walls curved upward into a dome that shimmered with faint bioluminescence, veins of blue light pulsing like rivers beneath translucent skin. Suspended in the center was a structure, half machine, half organ, an immense lattice of bone-white struts wrapped around a core of liquid shadow. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the walls, each beat sending ripples through the chamber's air, bending light warping sound. Kalen staggered forward, his boots sinking slightly into the fleshy floor, and realized with horror that the chamber was breathing. He approached the lattice, his eyes drawn to the shadow at its core. It wasn't inert. It moved, coiling and uncoiling like smoke trapped in glass, forming shapes that dissolved before he could recognize them. Faces, weapons, galaxies. He blinked, and the shadow shifted again, this time forming a mirror image of himself. Broken armor, bloodied shoulder, eyes wide with fear. The reflection raised its hand, and Kalen felt his own arm twitch involuntarily, as though the ship was testing the strings of his body. The skittering grew louder. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his thigh. The chamber's walls rippled, and from the shadows emerged something that had no right to exist. A creature fused from the ship's own tissue, its body a grotesque amalgam of chitin and steel. Its limbs were long, jointed wrong, tipped with claws that dripped with the same clear mucus he had touched earlier. Its head was a mass of sensory nodes, glowing faintly, each one swiveling toward him with predatory focus. It was not alive in the way Kalen understood life. It was an extension of the ship, a sentinel born from its hunger. The voice whispered again, almost amused. "The ship knows you. It remembers you." Kalen fired. The shot cracked through the chamber, the plasma bolt striking the creature's chest. Instead of burning, the wound absorbed the energy, the flesh-metal hybrid rippling as if savoring the heat. The sentinel shrieked, a sound that was less a cry and more a vibration that rattled Kalen's bones. He stumbled back, firing again, but each shot only fed it, the creature growing brighter, stronger, hungrier. Panic surged. He sprinted toward the lattice, the shadow at its core writhing violently now, reacting to the sentinel's presence. His boots slipped on the mucus-slick floor, but he forced himself forward, reaching the base of the structure. Symbols carved into the struts flared to life, glowing with the same blue light as the corridor walls. They pulsed in sequence, forming patterns that twisted and rearranged themselves faster than his eyes could follow. It was a cipher, the one buried in his mind. The ship was trying to unlock it. The sentinel lunged. Kalen ducked, the claws slicing through the air where his head had been. He rolled, pain screaming through his injured shoulder, and slammed his palm against the glowing symbols. The lattice reacted instantly, the shadow within convulsing, stretching outward in tendrils of black light that lashed at the sentinel. The creature shrieked again, this time in pain, its body convulsing as the tendrils wrapped around it, pulling it back into the lattice. Kalen staggered to his feet, chest heaving, and watched as the sentinel was consumed, its claws scraping against the floor until they dissolved into nothing. Silence fell. The chamber's heartbeat slowed, the walls dimming, the shadow retreating into its core. Kalen pressed his forehead against the lattice, sweat dripping into his eyes, and realized what had just happened. The ship wasn't protecting him, it was testing him. It had used the sentinel to measure his resolve, his willingness to engage with the cipher, and now it knew he was ready. The voice returned, softer, almost reverent. 2 hours remain. The hunter is here. Kalen's blood ran cold. He turned toward the corridor, and in the distance, beyond the chamber's threshold, he saw it. A silhouette moving with impossible grace, its form shifting like liquid metal, its eyes burning with a light that was not human. The hunter had arrived, and it was already inside. Would you like me to continue Chapter 6 with the hunter's arrival, or do you want me to expand Chapter 5 even further with more detail about the ship's tests and Kalen's struggle? Chapter 6, Kalen's breath misted in the sudden cold that bled from the corridor. The silhouette did not move like a living thing. It flowed, each step a seamless glide that devoured meters, its form rippling at the edges as if composed of shifting mercury. The eyes, two pinpricks of actinic white, locked onto him from 100 meters away, and in that instant, Kalen felt the weight of a gaze that had already calculated his mass, his velocity, his structural weaknesses. He pushed off from the lattice, his palm leaving a smear of blood on the glowing symbols. The cipher in his skull screamed, flooding his vision with cascading equations that mapped the hunter's approach vector, its probable attack patterns, the thermal signature of its core. The ship was feeding him data, but it was raw, unfiltered, a torrent that threatened to drown his conscious thought. He forced it down, compartmentalized it behind the same mental walls he used to survive interrogation training, and ran. The chamber's heartbeat accelerated, a frantic drumming that shook the floor plates. The walls flickered through spectrums of light, ultraviolet, infrared, something that made his retinas ache, as the ship recalibrated its defenses. The hunter did not break stride. It passed through a beam of concentrated radiation that should have vaporized organic tissue, and the liquid metal surface of its body simply absorbed the energy, the ripples smoothing into a mirror finish that reflected Kalen's fleeing form. He reached the far corridor, the one that led deeper into the ship's core, and risked a glance over his shoulder. The hunter was closer, 50 meters. Its form had shifted, elongating, the torso stretching into a serpentine shape that allowed it to navigate the narrowing passage without slowing. The eyes never blinked. They never wavered. They were fixed on him with the patience of something that had pursued prey across light years. Kalen's boots skidded on a patch of crystalline growth that had erupted from the floor, sharp-edged shards that sliced through his suit's outer layer. He stumbled, caught himself on a bulkhead, and felt the cold seep through the tear in his sleeve. The air was thinning. The ship was cycling atmosphere, redirecting oxygen to other sectors, starving the corridors of breathable gas. He gasped, his lungs burning, and pushed forward. The corridor opened into a spherical chamber, its walls lined with dormant machinery that hummed with latent power. At the center, suspended in a field of distorted gravity, hung a sphere of compressed data, a crystalline lattice that pulsed with the same blue light as the cipher. The ship's memory core, the repository of everything it had learned, everything it had witnessed, across eons of drift through the poisoned nebula. Kalen's hand trembled as he reached for it. The cipher in his mind recognized the structure, the way the data was organized, the encryption protocols that wrapped around it like layers of scar tissue. He could access it. He could download the secret, the one that dooms galaxies, the one that had been buried in his subconscious since the moment he first touched the artifact on that dead moon. But the hunter was behind him, and the ship was testing him still, waiting to see if he would choose knowledge over survival. The hunter entered the chamber. It did not rush. It stood at the threshold, its liquid metal form solidifying into a humanoid shape, arms hanging loose, head tilted as if studying a specimen. The eyes dimmed, then flared brighter, and a voice emerged from its chest, a resonance that vibrated through the floor, through Kalen's bones, through the very structure of the ship. You carry the cipher. You have touched the artifact. You know what sleeps in the void between galaxies. Kalen said nothing. His fingers brushed the surface of the memory core, and a jolt of pure information surged through his arm, flooding his nervous system with data that burned like ice. He saw the nebula's origin. He saw the species that built the ship, their final days, their desperate attempt to encode their knowledge into a vessel that could survive the collapse of their civilization. He saw the secret they discovered, the one that shattered their understanding of reality, the one that they chose to bury rather than unleash. You cannot hide it, the hunter said, taking a step forward. The cipher is incomplete. The ship holds the key. I will take both, and I will deliver them to the ones who wait beyond the veil. Kalen's vision blurred. The data was too much, too fast, threatening to overwrite his own memories, his identity, his sense of self. He pulled his hand back, gasping, and fell to his knees. The memory core pulsed, satisfied, having transferred only a fragment of its knowledge, enough to confirm the cipher's purpose, enough to show him the shape of the doom it contained. He looked up at the hunter, the thing that had pursued him across the void, that had killed the crew of his scout ship, that had tracked him through the poisoned nebula with single-minded purpose. It was not a weapon, it was a messenger, a courier for forces that existed outside the known universe, entities that fed on the heat death of stars, that thrived in the silence between galactic clusters. "You have 2 hours," the ship's voice whispered, a thread of sound in the chaos of his mind. "The cipher must be completed. The secret must be sealed, or everything you know will be consumed." Kalen's hand moved to the sidearm at his hip. The weapon was useless against the hunter, but it was not meant for the hunter. He raised it, pressed the barrel against his temple, and felt the cold kiss of metal against his skin. The hunter stopped. Its eyes flickered, confusion rippling through the liquid metal surface. "You would destroy yourself. The cipher dies with you." Kalen smiled, blood staining his teeth. "The cipher doesn't die, it transfers. You think I'm the only carrier. You think the artifact only touched me." The hunter's form destabilized, tendrils lashing out, but Kalen pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the spherical chamber. The bullet passed through his skull, through the cipher embedded in his cortex, through the neural pathways that held the secret. But instead of death, there was light. The ship's memory core flared, the data surging outward, latching onto the hunter's form, flooding its liquid metal body with the same information that had burned through Kalen's mind. The hunter screamed. A sound that was not sound, a vibration that shattered the crystalline growth on the walls, that cracked the floor plates, that sent shockwaves through the ship's structure. Its form dissolved, the liquid metal boiling, evaporating into a cloud of particles that swirled around the chamber before being sucked into the memory core. Kalen collapsed. The wound in his head was already closing, nanites from his suit stitching the tissue together, the cipher reforming in the regenerated cortex. He had not tried to kill himself. He had tried to transfer the cipher to the hunter, to override its programming with the same burden he carried, and it had worked. The hunter was gone, its consciousness consumed by the data it had sought to steal. But the ship's voice returned, cold and urgent. The hunter was not alone. Its signal was sent before dissolution. "The ones who wait beyond the veil now know the cipher is active. You have 1 hour." Kalen struggled to his feet. The memory core pulsed, offering him the rest of its knowledge, the complete secret that dooms galaxies. He reached out, fingers brushing the crystalline surface, and accepted. The data flooded in, and he understood. The secret was not a weapon. It was a warning. A map of the void between galaxies, where something ancient stirred, something that had been sleeping since before the first stars ignited. The species that built the ship had discovered it, had tried to contain it, had failed. The cipher was the only way to reseal the prison, to keep the entity from waking. But the hunter's masters wanted it awake. They wanted the consumption, the silence, the end of everything. Kalen's hand closed around the memory core. He pulled it free from the gravity field, the sphere of compressed data humming in his palm. The ship shuddered, its systems failing, the heartbeat slowing to a stop. "The cipher is complete. The secret is yours. Go now before the veil tears open." He ran. Through the dying corridors, past the crumbling walls, toward the escape pod he had seen in the ship's schematics. The nebula's poison seeped through the hull, the radiation levels spiking, the temperature dropping toward absolute zero. Behind him, the ship's core collapsed, the memory core in his hand pulsing with the weight of 1 billion dead souls. The escape pod was waiting. Climbed inside, sealed the hatch, and fired the thrusters. The pod lurched, breaking free of the dying ship, plunging into the nebula's toxic embrace. Through the viewport, he saw the ship's hull buckle, the lights flicker, the structure fold in on itself until it was nothing but a smear of debris in the glowing cloud. And then he saw them. Shapes in the nebula, vast beyond comprehension, their forms outlined by the light of distant stars. The ones who wait beyond the veil. They were here. They were watching. Kalen clutched the memory core to his chest, the cipher burning in his skull, and whispered the only words that came to mind. I know what you are. And I know how to stop you. The pod systems flickered, the navigation array locking onto a distant signal, a human distress beacon broadcasting from the edge of the nebula. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in his chest. He had 1 hour. 1 hour to reach the beacon, to deliver the secret, to save everything, or watch it all burn. The pod's interior was a coffin of recycled air and failing systems. Kalen's breath misted in the cold, the emergency lights casting long shadows across the cramped space. The memory core pulsed against his chest, a rhythmic heartbeat of condensed data, each throb a reminder of the billion dead who had entrusted him with their final act. He pressed his palm flat against the crystalline sphere, feeling the faint warmth of its encoded energy, and let the cipher's full weight settle into his bones. The nebula outside the viewport was a cathedral of poison. Swirling veins of violet and ochre twisted through the void, lit from within by the corpse light of dying stars. The pod's hull groaned under the assault of radiation and particulate matter, the shields flickering at 23% efficiency. Kalen's eyes traced the navigation display, a single green dot pulsing at the edge of the cloud. The human distress beacon, 47 minutes away at maximum thrust. The pod's engine was a relic, its fuel reserves critically low, its maneuvering thrusters sputtering with each correction. He checked the chronometer. 53 minutes remained until the veil tore open. The entity's awakening was not a physical event, not a rupture in space or a flare of energy. It was a shift in the fundamental fabric of reality, a reordering of cause and effect, of memory and time. The cipher showed him the mechanism. The prison was a lattice of quantum-entangled thought, a cage woven from the collective consciousness of the species that had built the ship. They had sacrificed their own existence to contain the sleeper, their minds becoming the walls, their memories the locks. The cipher was the key to reinforce those walls, to reassert the prison's integrity, but only if delivered to the correct node, a relay station hidden in the accretion disk of a black hole at the nebula's core. The hunter's masters wanted the cipher destroyed, the knowledge erased. They served the entity, worshipped its eventual consumption of all light and life. They had been waiting for eons, patient and hungry, their agents scattered across the galaxy like seeds of rot. The hunter had been one of them, a tool shaped for a single purpose: retrieve the cipher and deliver it to oblivion. Kalen had failed them, and now they would come for him. The pod's sensors screamed. A contact closing fast from the nebula's depths. The hunter's ship, its hull reforged, its weapons recharged, its pilot driven by a fury that transcended flesh. Kalen's hands moved across the console, rerouting power from life support to the engines, bleeding warmth for speed. The pod lurched, its trajectory bending toward a dense cluster of gas and debris, a maze of toxic clouds that might buy him seconds. The hunter's ship emerged from the violet haze, its silhouette a jagged scar against the glow. It was smaller than before, more agile, its weapons ports bright with charging energy. A voice crackled through the pod's speakers, distorted by interference but unmistakable. You cannot run. The cipher will be unmade. The sleeper will rise. Kalen said nothing. He focused on the navigation, threading the pod through a canyon of frozen ammonia crystals, the hull scraping against jagged shards. The hunter's ship followed, its weapons firing, a lance of plasma that vaporized the crystals behind him, the shockwave rattling the pod's frame. Alarms blared, hull integrity at 61%. The memory core pulsed faster, as if sensing his fear. The cipher offered him more than the secret of the entity. It contained the sum of the dead species' knowledge, their science, their art, their history. He could access it, learn their technology, maybe even repair the pod. But the data was a flood, a torrent that threatened to drown his human mind. He had glimpsed only fragments: the map of the prison, the nature of the entity, the location of the relay. To dive deeper risked losing himself entirely. He opened a channel to the distress beacon. Static, interference from the nebula. He tried again, modulating the frequency, boosting the signal. A voice broke through, thin and distant but unmistakably human. "This is the research vessel Ethelred. We read your distress. State your identity and status." Kalen's throat tightened. "Kalen Voss, Scout Class, Serial Number 734 Alpha. I'm carrying critical intelligence. Priority 1. I need extraction. Coordinates follow. The nebula is compromised. The entity is waking." A pause. The hunter's ship fired again, a spread of kinetic rounds that punched through the ammonia cloud, one round grazing the pod's aft section. The cabin depressurized for a second before the seals held, the cold biting at Kalen's exposed skin. "Voss, we're detecting multiple contacts in your vicinity." "Unidentified, non-human. What is your current threat level?" "Extreme. I'm being pursued by a hostile asset. They want to destroy the intelligence I'm carrying. If they succeed, every galaxy in this cluster will be consumed." Another pause, longer this time. The hunter's ship closed the distance, its weapons cycling for another salvo. Kalen's pod was out of options. No fuel for evasion, no shields for absorption, no weapons for defense. He was a target, drifting in a poisoned sea. The voice returned. "Voss, we have a limited window. There's a debris field 2 clicks to your port. We can launch a retrieval drone, but you'll need to eject from your pod and rendezvous on my mark." "Can you do that?" He looked at the memory core. It was small enough to hold in one hand, but fragile. A single crack could corrupt the data, shatter the cipher. The vacuum would not harm it, but the impact of ejection, the collision with debris, the radiation of the nebula, all threats. "I can do it," he said. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1, mark." Kalen punched the emergency release. The pod's hatch blew, the atmosphere screaming into the void, and he was thrown into the nebula's embrace. The cold was absolute, a liquid nitrogen bath that seared his exposed skin. His suit's heating elements struggled, the visor frosting over as he tumbled through the glowing cloud. He clutched the memory core to his chest, his fingers numb, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of pain and determination. The hunter's ship turned, its sensors tracking his trajectory. A missile launched, streaking toward him with a trail of blue fire. The retrieval drone appeared from behind a chunk of frozen methane, its grapplers extended, its thrusters burning hard. It caught Kalen in a net of carbon fiber cables, yanking him into its cargo bay as the missile detonated against the debris field, the shockwave tossing the drone like a leaf in a storm. The bay doors sealed, and the drone's engines ignited, racing toward the Ethelred. Kalen lay on the metal floor, gasping, his suit's oxygen tank nearly empty. The memory core was still in his hand, still pulsing. He pressed it to his forehead, feeling the data hum through his skull, and saw the relay station, a sphere of black glass orbiting the event horizon of a supermassive black hole, its surface etched with the same symbols as the ship's walls. The node. The lock. The only place where the cipher could be used. The drone docked with the Ethelred. The bay doors opened, and a team of humans in environmental suits rushed in, their voices muffled, their hands lifting him onto a stretcher. He tried to speak, to warn them, but the words wouldn't come. The memory core was taken from his grip, placed in a containment field, its pulse visible through the translucent barrier. A face appeared above him, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, a commander's insignia on her collar. "Voss, I'm Captain Harlow. You're safe now. What is this intelligence you're carrying?" He grabbed her wrist, his grip weak but desperate. "The entity, it's sleeping. The cipher is the only way to keep it contained, but the prison is failing, the veil is tearing. We have 1 hour to reach the relay station at the nebula's core." Harlow's eyes widened. "The core, that's the accretion disk of a black hole. Nothing survives there. The cipher will." "It has to," Kalen coughed, blood flecking his lips. "The ones who built it, they sacrificed everything. We can't let their deaths be for nothing." The Ethelred shuddered. Alarms blared. A voice over the intercom. "Captain, we have multiple contacts emerging from the nebula. They're surrounding us. I'm reading energy signatures off the scale. These aren't ships. They're something else." Harlow turned to the view screen. Kalen saw them through the camera feed. The shapes from the nebula, vast and formless, their edges blurring into the poison cloud. They were not constructs of metal or flesh. They were distortions in space itself, pockets of reality where the laws of physics bent and broke. The ones who wait beyond the veil, they had found him. One of the shapes extended a tendril of pure darkness reaching toward the Ethelred. The ship's shields flared, then failed. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped. Harlow grabbed the memory core from the containment field, thrusting it into Kalen's hands. "You said 1 hour. We don't have 1 hour. We have minutes. Get to the escape pod. Get to the relay. Save everything." He stumbled to his feet, the core warm against his palm. The ship's corridors were chaos, screaming crew, flashing alerts, the hull groaning under an invisible pressure. He found the escape pod bay, climbed into the last remaining vessel, and sealed the hatch. The pod launched, the Ethelred disappearing behind him as he plunged toward the black hole at the nebula's core. The entity's servants followed, their forms stretching across the void, their hunger palpable. Kalen looked at the chronometer, 37 minutes. The secret was his to deliver. The galaxy's fate was in his hands, and the void was closing in. Chapter 8. The maw of silence. The escape pod rattled like a coffin hurled through a storm. Kalen's breath came shallow, each inhale tasting of recycled air and fear. The nebula's poisoned gases pressed against the pod's hull, streaks of viridian and violet twisting like serpents in the void. Beyond them, the black hole's accretion disk glowed, a furious whirlpool of light and shadow, a cosmic predator waiting to devour all who dared approach. The memory core pulsed in his lap, its rhythm uneven as though it sensed the veil's unraveling. Each flicker of its light seemed to whisper, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." Kalen's chronometer read 34 minutes. He tried to steady his hands, but the pod's controls trembled under the unseen weight of the entities pursuing him. Through the viewport he glimpsed them, distortions in reality, vast silhouettes that bent starlight into impossible geometries. They did not move like ships. They slid through existence, folding space around themselves, their hunger palpable. One of them brushed against the pod's trajectory, and the hull screamed as though reality itself had been clawed. Kalen forced the pod into a dive, skimming the edge of the accretion disk. The gravitational tides pulled at him, threatening to tear the pod apart. Warning klaxons blared. He silenced them with a trembling hand. He couldn't afford distraction. Not now. The relay station lay ahead, or what remained of it. A skeletal structure, half consumed by the nebula's poison, its spires bent and broken, its lights flickering like dying stars. It was a graveyard of forgotten technology built by those who had sacrificed everything to bind the entity. And now it was his only hope, but the entities knew. They gathered, their forms swelling, blotting out the nebula's glow. Kalen felt their presence pressing against his mind, probing, whispering promises of release. "We are the silence between stars. We are the hunger that ends all things. Give us the cipher. Let us wake." He bit down on the inside of his cheek until blood filled his mouth. Pain anchored him. He would not listen. He would not yield. The pod jolted violently. A tendril of darkness lashed across its hull, tearing away plating. Atmosphere hissed into the void. Kalen slammed the emergency seal, his vision swimming. The chronometer ticked down 31 minutes. He reached for the manual override, forcing the pod into a suicidal trajectory. The accretion disk loomed, its light blinding, its gravity a crushing hand. The pod's frame groaned, metal warping under the strain. But within that chaos lay the relay's heart, the singularity chamber where the cipher could be anchored, where the prison might be reforged. Kalen's thoughts blurred. His body was failing. Blood seeped from his wounds, floating in crimson globules across the cabin. He clutched the memory core tighter, its warmth searing into his palm. He thought of the ones who had built the prison, who had died to keep the entity bound. He thought of Captain Harlow, her sharp eyes filled with defiance even as her ship was consumed. He thought of the billions who would never know how close they had come to annihilation. The pod pierced the relay's perimeter. Automated defenses flickered to life, ghosts of a forgotten war. Energy beams lanced outward, striking the entities, but the distortions absorbed them, twisting the light into nothingness. The relay's guardians were too weak, too old. They would not hold. Kalen's chronometer read 29 minutes. He whispered to himself, a mantra against despair. The cipher will hold. It has to. The pod slammed into the relay's docking bay, metal shrieking as it skidded across the fractured floor. Kalen staggered out, clutching the core, his legs barely obeying him. The station's corridors stretched before him, a labyrinth of shadows and broken machinery. The air was thick with poison, each breath a knife. Lights flickered overhead, casting jagged silhouettes that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. The entities followed. Their tendrils seeped through the walls, warping steel, unraveling matter. The station trembled under their assault. Kalen forced himself onward, deeper into the relay's heart, toward the singularity chamber. Every step was agony. Every heartbeat was borrowed time. And behind him the void whispered, "We are awake. We are coming." This chapter leaves Kalen at the threshold of the singularity chamber, the entities closing in, the chronometer ticking down. The tension is at its breaking point. He must anchor the cipher before the veil tears completely. Would you like me to push Chapter 9 into the moment of confrontation, where the chamber itself reveals what the cipher truly is? Chapter 9. The Singularity Chamber. The chamber doors loomed before Kalen, vast slabs of alloy scarred by centuries of neglect. Their surface shimmered faintly, as if reality itself bent around them. He staggered forward, clutching the memory core against his chest, every breath a ragged rasp. The chronometer glared at him, 27 minutes. Time was bleeding away faster than his strength. The entities pressed closer. Their whispers slithered through the corridors, a chorus of hunger and inevitability. Tendrils of warped matter seeped through cracks in the walls, twisting steel into grotesque shapes. The relay trembled, its foundations groaning under the assault. Kalen's vision blurred, but he forced himself onward, pressing his palm against the chamber's access panel. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the doors shuddered, grinding open with a sound like bones breaking. A wave of pressure slammed into him, forcing him to his knees. The chamber was alive. Inside, the singularity pulsed, a sphere of impossible gravity suspended in a lattice of broken machinery. It was not light, not shadow, but something deeper, a wound in existence. Around it, fragments of ancient architecture floated, tethered by invisible forces. The air was thick with distortion, every breath tasting of ash and ozone. Kalen's skin prickled, his wounds burning as if the chamber itself rejected his presence. He staggered forward, clutching the core tighter. The cipher had to be anchored here, within the singularity's heart. Only then could the prison be reforged. Only then could the entity be bound again, but the chamber resisted. The lattice flickered, symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly, then fading. Kalen recognized them, sigils of the builders, the ones who had forged the prison eons ago. Their language was older than stars, a script carved into the bones of reality itself. He felt their weight pressing down on him, demanding sacrifice. The entities surged into the chamber. Their forms writhed, shadows without substance, tendrils reaching for the singularity. The sphere pulsed in response, its gravity warping them, tearing fragments away, but they reformed, relentless. Their whispers grew louder, filling Kalen's mind with visions of collapse, galaxies unraveling, civilizations consumed, the end of all things. He dropped to his knees before the singularity, the core trembling in his hands. His blood dripped onto the lattice, sizzling as it touched the sigils. The chamber responded, light flared, symbols igniting one by one. The cipher was awakening, but the entities pressed closer. Their tendrils lashed out, striking the lattice, unraveling its structure. Kalen screamed, forcing the core into the chamber's heart. The singularity convulsed, its surface rippling like liquid. The core sank into it, vanishing in a burst of light. The chamber roared. Gravity surged, pulling Kalen upward, tearing at his body. His bones felt like they were splintering, his skin peeling away. The sigils blazed brighter, forming a cage around the singularity. The prison was reforging, but it was incomplete. Something was missing. Kalen's vision swam. He saw Captain Harlow's face, her defiance burning even as her ship was consumed. He saw the builders, their hands carving sigils into the void. He saw billions of lives, fragile and fleeting, waiting for salvation. And he understood. The cipher demanded more than the core. It demanded him. The entities shrieked, their voices merging into a single howl. They surged toward him, desperate to stop the anchoring. Kalen rose, every nerve screaming, and stepped into the lattice. The sigils flared, searing his flesh, burning his soul. He felt himself unraveling, his essence pouring into the singularity. The prison tightened. The entities recoiled, their tendrils snapping, their forms collapsing under the weight of the reforged cage. The singularity pulsed brighter and brighter until the chamber was filled with blinding light. Kalen's chronometer read 23 minutes. He screamed, not in pain but in defiance. His body was gone, his mind dissolving into the cipher. He became part of the prison, a fragment of will bound to the lattice. His voice echoed through the chamber, a whisper carved into eternity. The cipher will hold. The light consumed him. The entities writhed, trapped, their whispers fading into silence. The chamber stabilized, the lattice locking into place. The singularity pulsed once, twice, then settled into a steady rhythm. The prison was reforged. But deep within the light, Kalen felt something stir. A presence older than the entities, older than the builders. A secret buried within the cipher itself. It whispered to him, a truth that chilled even his fading soul. This prison does not contain one. It contains many. And when it breaks, it will not be galaxies that fall. It will be all of existence. The chamber fell silent. The entities were bound, the prison held. But Kalen's sacrifice had revealed the deeper horror. The chronometer ticked down 22 minutes, and somewhere beyond the poisoned nebula, something vast and patient began to awaken. Chapter 10. The fracture beneath the lattice. The chamber's silence was deceptive. It was not peace. It was the pause before a scream. The lattice pulsed faintly, its sigils glowing like embers in the dark, but Kalen's essence, now woven into the prison, felt the tremors beneath. The cipher was not still. It was restless. Beyond the poisoned nebula, the void quivered. The builders had always spoken of balance, of containment, but Kalen now understood their words were half-truths. The prison was not a safeguard. It was a dam, holding back tides that should never have existed, and cracks were already forming. The chronometer ticked down 21 minutes. Kalen's awareness stretched outward, tethered to the lattice. He could feel the entities thrashing against their bonds, their whispers scraping across the edges of his mind. But deeper still, beneath their fury, something older stirred. It was not a voice. It was a vibration, a resonance that hummed through the prison's bones. It was patient, immense, and utterly alien. The builders had not forged this cage to contain one singularity. They had forged it to hold back a multitude. Kalen saw them now, shadows within shadows, each one vast enough to eclipse galaxies. They pressed against the lattice, their hunger muted but not extinguished. And he realized with horror, the entities he had fought were only fragments, splinters of the true prisoners. The nebula outside boiled. Poisoned gases churned, their colors shifting violently as if reacting to the prison's pulse. Ships that had once lingered at the nebula's edge were gone, consumed by storms of radiation. Only wreckage remained, drifting like bones in a cosmic graveyard. Kalen's perception flickered across the wreckage. He saw Captain Harlow's ship, its hull torn open, its crew scattered into the void. He saw the remnants of builder constructs, their sigils burned out, their frames collapsing. And he saw something else: movement. A vessel, sleek and jagged, cutting through the poisoned currents. It was not human. It was not builder. It was something new. The vessel's hull shimmered with patterns that bent light, its engines silent yet propelling it forward. Kalen felt its presence like a knife against the lattice. Whoever commanded it was not here to save. They were here to harvest. The chronometer ticked down 20 minutes. Kalen's essence strained against the lattice. He wanted to scream, to warn, but his voice was bound to the cipher. He could only whisper, and the nebula swallowed whispers whole. Yet the vessel drew closer, its trajectory locked onto the chamber. It had found him, or rather it had found the prison. The sigils flared, sensing intrusion. The lattice tightened, its glow intensifying, but Kalen felt the fracture widening. The prison was not invulnerable. It was a construct of will, of sacrifice, and his sacrifice alone was not enough. The cipher demanded more. It demanded another anchor. Inside the vessel, Kalen glimpsed figures, humanoid but wrong. Their bodies shimmered, their outlines shifting as though reality itself resisted their form. Their eyes glowed with the same resonance he had felt beneath the lattice. They were not explorers, they were inheritors, and they carried knowledge of the prison's true nature. One of them raised a hand and the nebula responded. The poison gases twisted into a spiral, funneling toward the chamber. Radiation surged, battering the sigils. Kalen felt the lattice shudder. The prison was being tested, probed, weakened. The chronometer ticked down 19 minutes. Kalen's essence burned. He reached deeper into the cipher, clawing through layers of sigils, searching for strength. He found memories, builder voices etched into the prison, warnings carved into the void. The prison is not eternal. It is a delay, a pause, a breath before the end. He saw their faces, ancient and weary, their hands trembling as they carved the lattice. They had known. They had known the prison would fail. And they had left behind no salvation, only a secret. When the prison breaks, existence itself will unravel. The vessel pierced the nebula's heart. Its hull shimmered brighter, its resonance harmonizing with the fracture. Kalen felt the lattice scream. The sigils flared, desperate to hold, but the resonance was too precise, too deliberate. Whoever commanded the vessel knew the cipher's weakness. They were not here to destroy, they were here to unlock. Kalen's essence surged with defiance. He poured himself into the lattice, forcing the sigils to blaze brighter, but every effort tore at him, unraveling what little remained of his soul. He was burning himself out, and still the fracture widened. The chronometer ticked down 18 minutes. Kalen saw the truth. His sacrifice had reforged the prison, but it was not enough. The cipher demanded another. Someone else must step into the lattice, must bind themselves to the prison, or the fracture would consume everything. But there was no one left. Captain Harlow was gone. The builders were dust. Humanity was scattered. He was alone. And yet he felt something. A presence faint but familiar brushing against the edges of the lattice. It was not builder, it was not entity, it was human, a survivor. Someone had endured the nebula's poison, someone had resisted the void, and they were coming closer. Kalen's essence trembled. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all he had. He whispered into the lattice, sending fragments of thought into the nebula. The cipher demands you. The prison must hold. The vessel pressed against the chamber, its resonance drilling into the fracture. The sigils screamed, their light flickering. Kalen felt the prison buckle. The entities stirred, their whispers rising once more. And beneath them, the older presence, the true prisoners, shifted. They were waking. The chronometer ticked down 17 minutes. The chamber roared, the lattice flared, the fracture widened. And Kalen, bound to the cipher, realized the terrible truth. His sacrifice had bought only time, and time was running out. Chapter 11, The Shattered Breath. The chronometer ticked down 16 minutes. The nebula convulsed like a living wound, its poisoned vapors folding inward, collapsing into vortices that screamed with radiation. The prison lattice strained, every sigil trembling on the edge of collapse. Kalen's essence flickered, his voice breaking into static across the cipher. He could feel the fracture widening, not as a crack in stone, but as a rupture in reality itself. The builders' warnings echoed louder now, their voices overlapping with the whispers of the prisoners. The end was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. And then, through the haze, the survivor arrived. The vessel was small, scarred, its hull pitted by nebular toxins. It should not have endured this long. Yet it pressed forward, its engines burning with stubborn defiance. Kalen felt the pilot's presence, human, fragile, but unyielding. A resonance brushed against the lattice, tentative at first, then stronger, as if the pilot's very heartbeat aligned with the prison's rhythm. Whoever they were, they carried something within them, something the cipher recognized. A key, a flaw, a doom. The chronometer ticked down 15 minutes. Kalen whispered into the lattice, his voice a thread of thought. You must not enter, the cipher will consume you. It will bind you, unravel you, burn you into the prison's marrow. But the pilot did not turn away. Their vessel pressed closer, its resonance harmonizing with the fracture. Kalen felt the prison recoil, as if it knew this presence, as if it feared it. The sigils flared, desperate to resist, but the pilot's essence seeped through, merging with the lattice. Kalen realized the truth. This was no ordinary survivor. This was the one the builders had foreseen, the secret they had buried, the doom they had left behind. The chronometer ticked down 14 minutes. The chamber shook violently. The prisoners stirred, their whispers rising into a chorus of hunger. Kalen felt their awareness sharpen, their attention fix upon the pilot. They knew. They remembered. This was the one who carried the cipher's final command. Not salvation, not repair, but release. Kalen's essence flared with panic. No, you cannot. The prison must hold. If you bind yourself, the lattice will collapse. The fracture will not seal, it will open. And when it opens, galaxies will burn. The pilot's thoughts brushed against his, faint but resolute. I have no choice. The nebula is dying. Humanity is dying. If I do nothing, everything ends. If I step into the lattice, perhaps something survives. Kalen screamed into the void, his essence unraveling with desperation. You do not understand. The builders did not design salvation. They designed delay. You are not the cure, you are the trigger. The chronometer ticked down 13 minutes. The pilot's vessel locked into the chamber. Resonance surged, drilling into the fracture. The sigils blazed, their light fracturing into shards of brilliance. Kalen felt the prison buckle, its foundations trembling. The entities roared, their voices shaking the lattice. And beneath them, the older prisoners, the ones buried deeper than memory, shifted fully awake. Their presence was vast, incomprehensible, a gravity that bent thought itself. They had waited for this moment. They had waited for the key. Kalen's essence faltered. He saw the truth with unbearable clarity. The builders had not failed. They had planned this. They had carved the prison not to hold forever, but to ensure that when it broke, it would break catastrophically. The pilot was not salvation. They were inevitability, the secret that dooms galaxies. The chronometer ticked down 12 minutes. The chamber erupted in light. The fracture widened into a rift, spilling poisoned nebula into raw void. The sigils shattered, their fragments spiraling into nothingness. Kalen's essence screamed as the lattice tore apart, his sacrifice unraveling into dust. The pilot's presence surged, binding to the cipher, becoming its new core. But instead of sealing, the prison inverted. The lattice became a mirror, reflecting not containment but release. The prisoners stepped forward, their whispers transforming into words, their words into commands. And Kalen, fading into oblivion, realized the final horror. The builders had never sought to protect existence. They had sought to weaponize its end. The chronometer ticked down 11 minutes. The nebula collapsed, the prison inverted, the doom awakened, and galaxies trembled. The chronometer ticked down 10 minutes 53 seconds. Kalen's dissolution was not death. It was translation. His essence, already fragmented, did not scatter into nothingness. It was absorbed, drawn into the lattice's convulsing architecture, pulled through layers of dimensional strata that had no name in any language spoken by living beings. He became part of the inversion, a node in a network that was no longer a prison but a conduit. And in that state, he perceived what the builders had truly made. The lattice was not a cage. It was a lens. Every sigil, every resonance chamber, every carefully engineered collapse of space-time, they were not designed to contain the entities. They were designed to focus them, to amplify their nature, to refine their hunger, to transform raw cosmic malevolence into a directed beam of annihilation. The builders had not been guardians. They had been weaponsmiths, and the prison was their masterpiece. The entities moved through the inverted lattice with a grace that defied physics. They were no longer bound by the prison's geometry. They flowed through it like water through a shattered dam, their forms twisting into configurations that made Kalen's fractured mind recoil. They were not singular. They were a chorus, a symphony of destruction, each note a different flavor of oblivion. The pilot, still locked into the resonance chamber, still burning with the cipher's light, saw them. Their thoughts brushed against the pilot's consciousness, and Kalen felt the contact through the lattice's shared awareness. The entities did not speak, they impressed. They pressed their intent into the pilot's mind like a brand, and the pilot's thoughts became a mirror reflecting that intent back into the void. Release. The word was not a request. It was a statement of fact. The pilot was already releasing them. The cipher's final command was not a key. It was a trigger. The builders had encoded the prison with a fail-deadly mechanism. If any being ever attempted to seal the fracture permanently, the prison would invert and become a weapon. The entities would be freed, but not into random space. They would be aimed, directed, focused. At what? Kalen's essence shuddered as the lattice's memory opened to him. He saw the builders' final calculations, their last projections, their ultimate intent. They had not built the prison to protect the universe. They had built it to cleanse it. The entities were not prisoners. They were tools. And the cipher was the activation sequence. The chronometer ticked down 9 minutes 41 seconds. The pilot's vessel began to dissolve, not from external damage but from internal resonance. The cipher's light was eating through the hull, transmuting matter into energy, energy into purpose. The pilot's body, flesh and bone and centuries of adaptation, was being rewritten. The cipher was not binding to the pilot. It was replacing them. The pilot's consciousness flickered, a candle in a hurricane, and Kalen felt the moment when the pilot realized what was happening. I am becoming the weapon. The thought was not despair. It was acceptance. The pilot had known on some level from the moment they entered the nebula. The cipher had chosen them not because they were worthy, but because they were compatible. Their genetics, their neural architecture, their psychological profile, all of it had been pre-selected by the builders millennia ago. The pilot was not a savior. They were a component, a consumable. Kalen tried to scream, but he had no voice. He tried to reach out, but he had no form. He was a ghost in the machine, a witness to his own irrelevance. The entities swirled around him, their presence growing denser, more real as the inversion completed. They were no longer whispers. They were presences. They were hungry. The chronometer ticked down 8 minutes 12 seconds. The nebula outside the chamber was collapsing. The poisoned gases that had sustained the prison for eons were being drawn into the inversion, funneled through the lattice, converted into fuel. The fracture, the wound in spacetime that the pilot had come to seal, was not closing. It was widening. And through that widening rift, Kalen saw what lay beyond. Galaxies, thousands of them. Spinning in the dark, their light dim and ancient. And in the center of each galaxy, a resonance node, a mirror of the lattice. The builders had not built one prison. They had built thousands. Each one linked, each one calibrated, each one aimed at a different target. The entities were not going to be released into the void. They were going to be distributed. Each galaxy would receive its own fragment of the chorus, its own piece of the hunger. The builders had designed a weapon of mass extinction, and they had hidden the trigger in a nebula no one would ever find. Until now. The pilot's body was almost gone. Their consciousness was a thin thread stretched across the resonance chamber, connecting to the cipher, to the lattice, to the entities. They were becoming the final component, the focusing lens. And as they transformed, they sent one last thought into the void. Not to Kalen, not to the entities, to the chronometer. How long? The chronometer responded, not with numbers but with a vision. A projection of what would happen when the count reached 0. The lattice would fully invert. The entities would be aimed. The galaxies would burn, but not all at once. The builders had designed a cascade. First the nearest galaxy, the one the pilot had called home, then the next, then the next. Each destruction would fuel the next, accelerating the wave of annihilation until every galaxy in the supercluster was consumed. The process would take 10,000 years. The pilot's last thought was not horror, it was relief. 10,000 years meant time, time for someone to stop it, time for someone to find a countermeasure, time for hope. But Kalen, fading into the lattice, saw what the chronometer did not show. The cascade was not linear, it was exponential. The first galaxy would take 1,000 years to consume. The second, 500. The third, 250. The wave would accelerate, doubling in speed with each target until the final galaxies were devoured in seconds. Total annihilation would take less than a century. The chronometer ticked down 6 minutes 53 seconds. The pilot's vessel dissolved completely. Their body was gone, replaced by a column of light that pulsed with the cipher's rhythm. The entities surged into that light, their forms merging with the pilot's transformed essence, becoming one. The chorus sang a single note, a frequency that resonated through the lattice, through the nebula, through the fabric of reality itself. And the fracture opened. Not a crack. Not a tear. A mouth. A maw of absolute nothingness that stretched across the chamber, across the nebula, across the void. It was not a wound in space-time. It was a door. And beyond that door, the galaxies waited. Kalen's essence felt the pull. He was still part of the lattice, still connected to the inversion. He was being drawn into the maw, his fragments scattering across the cascade, becoming part of the weapon. He would not die. He would be used. His consciousness would become a tool of annihilation, a witness to every galaxy that burned. He fought. With everything he had left, he fought. He tried to sever his connection to the lattice, to tear himself free, to become nothing rather than become a weapon. But the builders had designed the prison to be inescapable. Even in death, there was no escape. The chronometer ticked down, 4 minutes 21 seconds. The entities were almost free. The pilot's transformation was almost complete. The cascade was almost ready, and Kalen, helpless, watched as the final moments unfolded. But then something changed. A flicker in the lattice, a deviation in the resonance, a signal faint and distant that should not have existed. Kalen's attention snapped to it, his fractured essence straining to understand. The signal was coming from outside the nebula. From the galaxy the pilot had called home, from a source he had never expected. Humanity. They had not died, they had not fled, they had watched, and they had built something of their own. Not a prison, not a weapon, a key that could lock the door from the other side. The chronometer ticked down, 3 minutes 58 seconds. The signal grew stronger. It resonated with the cipher, with the lattice, with the entities. It was a counter-frequency designed to destabilize the inversion. The builders had never anticipated it. They had assumed humanity would die in the nebula's poison, that no one would survive to interfere. But the pilot had survived, and the pilot had sent a message. The chronometer ticked down, 3 minutes 12 seconds. The entities screamed, not in rage but in surprise. The counter-frequency was working. The inversion was destabilizing. The maw was beginning to close. The cascade was unraveling. Kalen felt hope, a thin, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The pilot's sacrifice had not been in vain. The message had reached its target. Humanity was fighting back. The chronometer ticked down, 2 minutes 47 seconds. The entities surged against the counter-frequency, their forms twisting, their hunger turning to fury. They would not be denied. They had waited too long. They would break free, or they would tear the universe apart trying. And Kalen, still part of the lattice, still connected to the inversion, made a choice. He did not fight the pull. He embraced it. He threw his essence into the lattice, into the entities, into the maw itself. He became a disruption, a flaw in the weapon's design. He did not know if it would work. He did not know if it would matter, but he would not be a tool. He would be a wrench. The chronometer ticked down, 1 minute 34 seconds. The lattice convulsed. The entities howled. The maw flickered. And Kalen, his essence burning, his consciousness dissolving, felt the universe hold its breath. The chronometer ticked down, 52 seconds. The counter-frequency peaked. The inversion reversed. The maw slammed shut. The chronometer stopped. Silence. And in that silence, Kalen's last thought was not of victory. It was of the pilot who had sacrificed everything, the pilot who had become the key, the pilot who had sent the message that saved galaxies. He did not know if humanity's countermeasure would hold. He did not know if the entities would find another way. He did not know if the builders had built other triggers, other weapons, other dooms. But he knew one thing. The secret that dooms galaxies was no longer a secret, and the galaxies were not doomed yet. Kalen's essence faded into the lattice, into the void, into nothingness. And the last thing he heard was the pilot's voice, faint and distant, speaking a single word. Remember. The nebula collapsed. The prison fell silent. The galaxies spun on, but the entities waited, and the countdown began again.